Hashtag first watch.
Hello, and thanks for tuning in to the First Watch podcast. I'm really excited to have you aboard because today I'm debuting a brand new variety of episode for this channel, the Double Bill. On these segments, I'll be taking a look at two films that I feel have noteworthy or interesting connections of really any variety. The Magic Mike episode, which I dropped a couple weeks ago, can sort of be seen as a dry run for this, but future examples will not necessarily be focused on a movie and its sequel. On this week's episode, I'm going to be logging on and delving into two Japanese films, Pulse and Paprika, to discuss some striking similarities and important differences between the two films and the way each reflects on its core ideas, including dreams, ghosts, isolation, and of course, the internet. Around this time on every episode, I like to give a warning. I'm going to be diving through various plot points of both films, so if you haven't seen them, and if you're especially spoiler-averse, now is the time to check out two of the most creative Japanese films of the 2000s. For this episode, I also want to take a moment to throw in a courtesy trigger warning. Due to the subject matter of Pulse, I'm going to be talking a little bit about suicide. Not in a graphic sort of way, but if that's a topic that makes you uncomfortable, please be aware, it will come up. For everyone who still wants to tag along, let's jump on in. Pulse is a 2001 Japanese horror film directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa, no relation. And like many installments in the J-horror genre, it mixes traditionally Japanese supernatural elements with contemporary technology to create a sort of fusion between old genre ideas and the burgeoning anxieties of the nascent 21st century. J-horror, as some may remember, was huge. It traces its roots pretty far back to classics like Hausu, and absolutely exploded in the 2000s after such titles like Audition, Ju-on, and of course, Ringu. A ton of these movies, including Pulse, got American remakes, the bulk of which were bad. And even though I'm a pretty vocal defender of Gore Verbinski's The Ring, a movie that pretty well shook me when I saw it in middle school, I think the reason the US renditions failed to live up is because American filmmakers and studios never really wrapped their heads around the idea that J-horror, as the name really should have implied, was specific to Japan. And that's a big part of what this episode is about, teasing out what makes this film, and Paprika, the unique and uniquely Japanese works that they are. Pulse is a bit tricky to synopsize, being as it follows two parallel storylines and doesn't involve a lot of constructed plot. Much of the film centers around characters chatting and staring at computer screens, and this loose quality is probably why it took me 2 attempts to watch the film. And to be clear, that's not an indictment. I made the rather ill-fated choice to try to start Pulse around 1 a.m. to try to capitalize on its spooky atmosphere, and I was just too tired to stay up. And I also knew that I wasn't grasping everything it wanted to get across. After my first attempt, which lasted about 40 minutes, I shut off the movie and shot off a DM to my friend who loves the film, and I recommended he prioritize Paprika, which he had not yet seen. Even in my drowsy state, I detected some strong connections between the two films. Among those? Well, in spite of what I just said about how these two films have ideas baked into them that are essential to their DNA, and in spite of the fact that both Paprika and Pulse are deeply conceptual movies, I feel that they actually work on 2 levels. You can delve headlong into their melange of ideas, themes, and subtexts, or you can let them just wash over you. And they're both really effective regardless of the approach. Paprika, for instance, could accurately be characterized as a psychological thriller, and its intense scenes and vibrant, dreamlike, surrealistic visual style are more than enough to keep a watcher, especially a first-timer, enraptured by its vibe. And I can personally attest that Pulse shares this quality. Even while sleepy, its quiet horror managed to creep inside of my brain and unsettle me. Since that first attempt and that fateful DM, the idea of doubling Pulse with Paprika has intrigued me. And obviously it inspired this episode. And my actual first watch, podcast name drop, really solidified their relationship. Pulse concerns individuals who are coming into contact with ghostly spirits, phantoms which haunt their computer screens. And coupled with a string of suicides, it makes a striking document that teases out a real anxiety of Japan at this time. Suicide rates, particularly among men in the country, absolutely skyrocketed in the 90s and 2000s. This has been attributed to a lot of different things, but many people at the time gestured to the internet as one of the things which contributed to the trend. This is really the first point of comparison between Pulse and Paprika, because to me it's interesting how from the outset, each film is really using its concepts and directly tying their internet-based plots into issues of mental health. Unlike Pulse, Paprika isn't so much dipping into the anxiety of mental illness, but instead taking a look at the institutions and people dedicated to preventing it. Paprika is the final film of legendary anime filmmaker Satoshi Kon, one I consider to be a central document within his canon, and in many respects a bold thesis statement on his career as a whole. This is one of my favorite movies of all time, and even if you don't think it's Kon's greatest film, it is absolutely the most Satoshi Kon film. Broadly, Paprika details a world where, through the use of brand new technology, people can enter one another's dreams. And in particular, the film follows protagonist, Dr. Chiba, who does this with a specifically therapeutic aim. Though it is a dense film, full to the brim with a ton of concepts and eye-popping, reality-melting visuals, the real thrust of Paprika is centered around the idea of healing, of connection, and some other things we'll tease out later in this episode. The connection to keep in mind here is that each movie is heavily influenced by ideas of mental health. And what helps that connection is that in Paprika, dreams aren't just dreams. As the titular character, Chiba's alter ego, puts it, don't you think dreams and the internet are similar? They are both areas where the repressed conscious mind vents. Kon here is presenting the internet as collective consciousness, a shared dream space in which its participants unfurl their inner psyches. And it's a pretty apt comparison, and one which solidifies that both this film and Pulse have a lot to say about mental health in the early days of the internet. Pulse, being a horror film, is really tapping into fear, and in particular, a fear of isolation. Much to the contrast of the bursting at the seams Paprika, its characters are haunted by empty spaces. The specters haunting the technology in the film specifically cry out that death is eternal loneliness. In that the ghosts are then visiting computers, it suggests a strong relationship between being online and being isolated, which is an idea that really holds true even now, that the tools that bring us together also keep us from truly connecting. And in the age of COVID quarantines, where we have to refresh our Twitter feeds just to feel some level of connection, that material hits hard. There's also a thread in this film that I think I'd be really remiss not to mention, and this is where the trigger warning from earlier in this episode really comes into play. Between my first attempt to watch Pulse and my first full watch, a friend of mine, someone I knew largely online, took his own life, and within the space of that very difficult day, there were new tweets from his account, ones which he had scheduled, and that event from my real life really gave this movie something of an all too relevant context. Suddenly, this film about ghosts lingering inside of machines after a person's demise, especially sitting side by side with so many characters taking their own lives, really started to feel not just like sharp genre, but alarmingly prescient and really emotionally striking. Paprika has some thoughts about suicide as well, though they're definitely a bit less at the forefront. In the first half hour of the film alone, we see the protagonist accidentally nearly jump off a balcony to her own demise, as well as an intentional attempt from a character called Himuro. Connected to this is the way that Paprika, the character, represents both empathy and therapy. From the opening scenes of the film, we see her entering into people's dreams to try to help soothe their trauma and their depression. Again, Paprika is really looking at the preventative aspects of mental health, how to keep people from taking their own lives, how to use these tools to address the problem. One thing that elevates Pulse is how its horror is entwined with Japanese culture. Technology naturally has become a really hot topic in horror films worldwide, and it will only continue to do that as we progress into the future. But in Japan, there's a lot of specific subtext to technology. After the Second World War, the United States more or less forced Japan to convert their war machine into something more benign. The modern Japan that we know, the country which makes computers, consoles, cars, televisions, was born then. And so when technology is a part of any contemporary Japanese fiction, it lives with that implied subtext. America's complex relationship with Japan set the back half of its 20th century into motion, and inexorably, there is also a relationship between that period in history and the social realities of that country today. There's a direct line between young Japanese people, particularly men, feeling increasingly isolated that stretches back to the 40s. When you couple that with the historical traditionalism of Japanese culture that dates back centuries, you can sort of see where J-horror was born. A collaboration of old and new, yokais and technology, old ghosts, new environments, and the palpable tension between the two. That's something that runs through a lot of Kohn's work as well, particularly movies like Millennium Actress, which is like a crash course on Japanese history, and in general, the interplay between traditional and modern Japan is at the forefront of a ton of anime from the last decade, perhaps most notably Makoto Shinkai's much heralded Your Name. One other comp to World War II that lives inside of Pulse is perhaps a bit more sideways, but I think it's still kind of interesting. Fans of Alan Moore's Watchmen will recognize the phrase Hiroshima lovers. It's a recurring image in the comic of a blackened silhouette of a couple in embrace, in theory, the remnant of the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Pulse, when one of the characters commits suicide, there is always someone there who sees their shadow imprinted upon a wall in more or less this exact manner. It's an impression of a person, a ghostly memory that lingers after they depart. To tie it into the movie's use of the internet, it's like a digital footprint, a remainder of your time spent on the planet and online. And if Pulse is about footprints, Paprika is about, shoes, I guess. Instead of focusing on what's left when someone is gone, it's interested in exploring the relationship between person and persona. As stated before, Paprika is like a dream avatar for protagonist Dr. Chiba. If Pulse's silhouette shows a shadow, Paprika, again the character, is sort of like a refraction, a bending of the light to make a new color. And again, this connects with ideas of the internet. While in real life, I am Zachary, here on YouTube I am The First Watch Podcast, and on Twitter, I am Vampire Hunter Z. The more you dig, the more versions of myself have existed, leaving their own digital traces, marking the two films' most inevitable connection, that there is both a self and a digital self. And that's something that can be good, bad, or neither. Paprika in particular seems to be looking at the internet as a place without guidance, which in 2006 it very much was. As multiple characters say, the technology, the scientific key that allows us to open the doors to our dreams is, shall we say, unfinished. The sights and sounds of the dream parade that pervades many of Paprika's scenes very much feels like the cacophonic flow of internet chatter, even today. Both films have a good bit to say about mass hysteria as well, a place from which both of their conflicts are derived in some senses. It's natural, once you've got so many people hooked into the web, to wonder, what's the impact if someone sends something dark over the wire? Earlier in the episode, I mentioned that many people have asserted a connection between suicidal trends in Japan and increased internet activity in the country in the late 90s. And much of this is attributed merely to increased exposure to suicidal people, suicidal ideation, etc. In Pulse, coming into contact with these haunted computers seems to have a horrific impact on the users, leading each of them into a catatonic depressive state and eventually to take their own lives. And as the film progresses, this problem goes national and eventually global. There is a lot of death in Pulse, and the suggestion seems to be that there is a kind of infectiousness to this morose trend, aided by the technology in play, and it's really meeting no resistance. Such ideas are also present in Paprika, as well as the Satoshi Kon directed series that preceded it, Paranoia Agent. In both that show and this film, the hysteria manifests itself physically. This begins with the dream imprinting itself onto the waking, which conceptually sounds pretty similar to the way that increased internet behavior can imprint itself onto the way that we all look at the world. The chaotic dream parade, which, it must be said, comes complete with at least a handful of Japanese businessmen leaping apparently to their deaths, connecting again to these ideas of suicide and suicidal ideation, eventually seeps into the waking world, becoming ever larger and more uncontrollable. And as this happens, the shared dream becomes darker and more dangerous. Just as in Pulse, ideas are easily shared between people, forming something like a massive consciousness, and it really just takes a nudge to send the whole thing spiraling down. Paprika sets itself apart from Pulse, however, by going full-on fantasy comic book mode. As stated way back in the beginning of the episode, it's about preventative measures, and it's about healing. Pulse is a dark movie. It's scary, and it's upsetting. And Paprika gets upsetting too, but its guiding light shines brightly. It's an aspirational story about taking responsibility, being empathetic, making healthy connections, and fighting that negativity to reclaim what's beautiful about the dream space. Of course, being that this movie is wild, that manifests itself as Paprika and Shiba fusing, person and avatar becoming one giant baby who slurps the forces of toxicity like spaghetti to win the day. Man, I love Satoshi Kon. To expand upon this, Paprika presents the grand ambition of the technological Dreamshare project at its center as pursuing a deeper connection. It's all about stepping up and taking responsibility and making the internet, this dream space, and the world as a whole a better place. In a year where the pandemic forced me, like everyone else, into isolation, I have taken such respite and such joy in the connections I have made online. And I have tried to pay the love I have received forward. And to me, that's the thesis of Paprika. In Pulse, there's nothing to hold back the dread. And in Paprika, empathy is the levee that holds back the tide of despair. For as conceptual and as challenging a filmmaker as Kon was, his works burst with love and champion connection as the world's greatest saving grace. As a double, I think these two films work wonderfully together. And in fairness, Paprika actually has a lot more going on than what I've even really unpacked here, and it would double well with a lot of different films. Who knows, maybe I'll write about it again someday, because a full Paprika podcast would take 3 times the runtime of the film to really do it justice. But I love talking about it alongside Pulse. Together, they're 2 speculative fiction tales about the danger of online life with respect to mental health that tease out Japanese culture at that time that still ring as true now as they did then. If you plan on doubling these, I'd really recommend going with Pulse first and Paprika second. Give yourself a little darkness and then a little light. But you really can't go wrong either way. They're 2 awesome movies, and I really enjoyed getting to break them down together. Thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please feel free to like or share. I hope to talk with you all again soon.